Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drilldown, where we relentlessly expose cronyism, corruption, and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. The co-host of this program, of course, Eric Eggers. Eric, I'm thinking about the land of my ancestors, Switzerland, because we just had a very important conclave that ended there.
And I think you're doing well by your genetic ancestry, because who conglomerates, who convenes in Switzerland? It's the global elites. And who better to be a global elite than Peter Schweizer, America's favorite #1 New York Times? Just because you dress down doesn't mean you don't glow up professionally and personally.
Yeah, well, we'll have a conversation about that later. But yes, Davos has just concluded. There's a lot of mystery about Davos. There's a lot of things that have been said about it. But this year, it may be, or maybe not, slightly different than it was in the past, because they invited a couple of critics to show up and sort of tell them what they thought about what was wrong with Davos. So the first one we're going to hear from is the president of Argentina, Javier Milei. Here's what he had to say to Davos.
Today, I'm here to tell you that the Western world is in danger. And it is endangered because those who are supposed to have to defend the values of the West are co-opted by a vision of the world that inexorably leads to socialism and thereby to poverty.
The second clip is from Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, who was also invited to go there. Kevin Roberts, obviously not a fan of Davos. We have a longer clip from Kevin Roberts, but here's what he highlights and what he says to the elite that are gathered in Switzerland.
Political elites tell the average people on 3 or 4 or 5 issues that the reality is X, when in fact reality is Y. Take immigration. Elites tell us that open borders and even illegal immigration are okay. The average person tells us in the United States that both rob them of the American way of life. They're right. President Trump will take that on behalf of the average American. Elites also tell us that public safety isn't a problem in big American cities. Just travel to New York or Washington or Dallas, Texas. The average person will tell you that the lack of public safety damages not just the American way of life, but their life. President Trump will take that on. Thirdly, I guess the favorite at the World Economic Forum is climate change. Elites tell us that we have this existential crisis with so-called climate change, so much so that climate alarmism is probably the greatest cause for mental health crisis in the world. The solutions, the average person know, based on climate change are far worse and more harmful and cost more human lives, especially in Europe during the time that you need heating, than do the problem and the problems themselves. Fourth, 2 more here, Robin. Okay. The fourth, China. The #1 adversary, not just to the United States, but to free people on planet Earth. Not only do we at Davos not say that, we give the Chinese Communist Party a platform. Count on President Trump ending that nonsense. And fifth, as we sit here, another supranational organization, the World Health Organization, is discussing foisting gender ideology upon the global South. These are practices that are under review, if not being rejected, by countries in Northern Europe. The new president, especially if it's President Trump, will, as you like to say, trust the science. He will understand the basic biological reality of manhood and womanhood. And do you know why? Not because of retribution, not because he's a dictator, but because he has the power of the American people behind him. And it's connected to Senator Portman's excellent point that in addition to needing a vigorous executive, we look forward to having the popular will inform both the House and Senate in 2025 to pass laws on all of those issues and many others. Ultimately, Robin, I think President Trump, if in fact he wins a second term, is going to be inspired by the wise words of Javier Milei, who said that he was in power not to guide sheep, but to awaken lions. That's what the average American and the average free person on planet Earth wants out of leaders.
So, Eric, that's a lot to unpack, a lot to understand. Fortunately, we have a guest here today that knows all about this. And in fact, Kevin Roberts said, I think via Twitter, that when he went to Switzerland, he actually read our guest's book, and it was vital to prep him for that speech.
He said, I think we've seen some internal communications from Kevin Roberts that it put him in exactly the right mindset. So, you've got Seamus Bruner, author of Controligarchs. Last year, it was the word of the year in Australia. This year, Kevin Roberts is reading it as he goes to Davos to give that speech and talk about the way that the state leads to poverty. We even have, I think, Seamus is such a cultural phenomenon. There's even a Jeopardy question from Controligarchs that was heard just last week.
Let's go with agriculture for 800.
This founder of Microsoft became America's largest private owner of farmland with around 250,000 acres in 18 states. Brian.
Who is Gates?
Yes.
So joining us now, of course, is Seamus Bruner. Seamus, author of the great book Controligarchs that came out last year. He is a vice president for research here at the Government Accountability Institute, does a fantastic job. So I want to get your sense, Seamus, from how much has really changed at Davos. You do have a couple of outspoken critics there. They speak candidly to them face to face, which I think is kind of new for Davos. Has much changed?
Davos wants you to think so. So they made the theme this year rebuilding trust. So obviously they do have some self-awareness. Usually people flying on private jets lecturing everybody about climate change, you'd think they don't have any self-awareness. But they do have some self-awareness. They want to rebuild trust with all of us who are critics of their plans for our future. Has much changed? If you look at the agenda, the schedule of events for this year's Davos, not much has changed. And it's full speed ahead on the climate crisis, on the war on farmers, on artificial intelligence, which is so vital to many of their plans, whether it's with digital IDs or central bank digital currencies. They're talking about those. You had the IMF managing director there talking about how critical central bank digital currencies are. So, yes, they're trying to rebuild trust. I applaud them for inviting Dr. Roberts. He gave an amazing speech.
Yep.
And same with Javier Milei. I mean, they are, and they invited Donald Trump to Davos. So they've done this before. They've had critics go into Davos and tell their side of events. But there's a lot to be worried about what they're working on.
What I think's fun is your book talks about the way that the global elites, these controligarchs, essentially have positioned themselves with relationships with the state to make money off of every aspect of your life and control your life to put money in their pockets. That's essentially the combination of what the Argentinian president and Kevin Roberts were saying, right? The Argentinian president saying, hey, state control leads to poverty. It's what we've seen in Argentina. Kevin Roberts is saying, here's what the state's trying to do that, right? With immigration, with climate change in China. And you have documented exactly how they try to use climate change as the ultimate rationale to control what we're doing, which I think ultimately everyone else does less in the name of global temperature cooling. What's the most radical and ridiculous thing they talked about in Davos? And there's a new term. Controligarchs was last year's term. There's a new term we may be hearing that suggests, hey, are we guilty of committing more crimes against the environment we didn't even know we were doing?
Yeah, that's right. A new Orwellian term just dropped, ecocide. You're killing the environment if you go hunting. So to all the hunters out there, fishermen, just know you are committing crimes against the climate, and they want to come for your fish, for your.
So this was actually discussed at Davos.
Yes, yeah. Ecocide is the new term.
And fishing's a form of ecocide.
Yeah, fishing's a form of ecocide. Hunting, fertilizing your lawn is a form of ecocide. So just be careful out there.
I will say, in their defense, I'm not a huge fan of yard work. So if I can be a better steward of the earth by being more negligent of my yard, I'll take one for the team that way.
Yeah. Yeah, so in other words, if the neighbors are complaining about your lawn's not looking so great.
Quiet, fascist!
Exactly. We're just trying to conform with the environment. So here's my read on it. My read on it is there is actually a massive pushback that you see what Davos is pushing. Of course, Davos is not a government. They don't have actual power, but they have what Bill Clinton called convening authority, right? They bring the powerful together. Some of them are government officials, some of them are business leaders, and they talk in unison. They plan for what they think the future course and direction of the planet should be. And there's been a lot of pushback. We have protests by farmers. God bless these farmers in Europe. in Scotland, elsewhere in the world that are protesting some of the things that the World Economic Forum is pushing. You see a lot of the conversation in the United States among among members of Congress who don't like what the World Economic Forum is pushing. So there is absolutely a resistance that I haven't really seen as much of anymore. It seems to be invigorated, and this is probably how they're trying to react, which with kind of this window dressing, right? No, listen, let's talk. We all want to talk together and convene. While at the same time, they're doubling down. I mean, the stuff about hunting, some of the other things they're pushing, they're not softening their agenda at all.
Well, if one of the global agenda moves is, bringing China into the fold, right? And that was one of the takeaways, that China's at the table of this Davos. You talked about it red-handed. What is China's strategy? What is it? Big talk, soft stick? I mean, they will talk aggressively against you in one way, but then work against that from a public policy standpoint. Is that what we've seen at Davos?
That's actually, that's a great point. That's pretty much what it looks like is happening. It's, big help with a little bad mouth.
Yep.
This year they're talking about a global carbon tax. In order to achieve a global carbon tax, they'll need carbon footprint trackers. And they've talked about carbon footprint trackers for years now at Davos, where you're measuring how much you as an individual are killing the planet, in their words. I mean, Alibaba is actually, I've got a quote from the president: "We are developing through technology an ability for consumers to measure their whole carbon footprint." And
so tell people who Alibaba is,
and
Alibaba
and why that
is
like the Chinese Amazon, but bigger. So it's one of the biggest Chinese companies. They're every company in China has to be close with the government in order to succeed.
And so what's ironic about China's company telling people to do that?
Yeah, so when they talk about climate change, they never talk about the world's largest polluter, which is China. Most of the plastics in the ocean come from either China or India. Building a new coal plant every other week, it seems, in China. But they never say that to China's face. So it kind of reeks of the hypocrisy of like a private jet exhaust.
Well, and it's interesting because the Wall Street Journal had a piece during Davos where they discussed the fact that Davos is starting to lack maybe a little bit of confidence because so many of the things they believed 10 years ago have turned out not to be true. One of them was that the climate was going to, be in a terrible shape. It's really not. It's kind of where it was 10 years ago. But even more to the point, the Chinese model, they all upheld that the Chinese had figured out how to create a planned economy where you get growth and you get the dynamism of capitalism. And you look at the state of the Chinese economy right now, it's not good. So they're maybe starting to realize that a lot of things they advocated haven't worked out. And I agree with you. The true believers are still going to be the true believers. But some of the guys that were just going around, it was like in high school, the guys that linger around with a popular crowd just because they want to be with a popular crowd, maybe realizing these guys aren't as smart as they actually pretend to be.
Well, in recent Davos conferences, they've said that there would be recessions in Europe and the United States. They also said FTX was like the crypto wave of the future.
Right.
And that's, now there's an indictment on the table there.
Yeah. They've been wrong about a lot of things.
A lot of things. Yeah. They're wrong on the regular basis. The other thing with China is like China, if do we see them gain an influence with this elite crowd? Because if climate change is the thing that we're using as, hey, we need to all curb our behavior, China doesn't actually have to curb any behavior according to the Paris Climate Accord for another 25 years. So it seems like they would seize the fact that their flawed economic model, they need everyone else to kind of take a step back in the name of climate change so they can continue to ascend. Do we see that happening at all?
Yeah, the partnerships, the business relationships with China continue unabated. Meta, Facebook just made a huge deal last November with Tencent to manufacture their Oculus headsets. So Facebook just re-entered China after a 14-year hiatus. So they're a lot of the tech guys are still totally in league with China. Bill Gates, Microsoft, et cetera. So yeah, China is critical. George Soros has said in the past that China is critical to the New World Order. That's a more or less a quote from him. And so China's essential to the plan's cooperation with China. The Belt Road stuff, they're on board with that. So at their peril, at all of our peril, Davos does love China.
Well, and then you had the other big issue that was looming at Davos, which was artificial intelligence. And, this is obviously a controversial subject. It's scary to a lot of people. You have a lot of people like Elon Musk that have raised questions about, I don't know, killer robots. But the vision that they have for artificial intelligence is pretty glowing, right? I mean, it's pretty glowing and seems to be wildly optimistic in the sense that it's going to benefit them, but it's not going to necessarily benefit the rest of us. It's another one of these gaps between the elites at Davos and the reality for the rest of us.
Why do you think it won't benefit us? Just out of curiosity.
Well, the concerns are, I mean, there was a report that came out. They're expecting 60% of all jobs will be negatively affected by artificial intelligence. It may not be that bad, but think about all the jobs that are being done right now that are already being replaced by artificial intelligence, and it's not going to affect these elites, right? I mean, it's not going to affect their wealth creation or their economic viability. But was that a big issue, artificial intelligence, and what did they discuss there?
Yeah, artificial intelligence was really the unofficial theme. So it was every day they had, several panels on artificial intelligence. They're all very optimistic about it, mostly because it's big tech companies who will be benefiting the most here. And it remains to be seen whether it will be like the computer. A lot of people feared computers would put secretaries out of business.
Right.
And it turns out that computers created more jobs than ever. So it may AI may eliminate all of the menial tasks, but there's reason to be concerned. I mean, just the creatives, people who do graphic design and videography, and I mean, you push a few buttons and you can spit out graphics that will render a lot of people's graphic design jobs obsolete. And same thing, like I just saw a report from Microsoft. That radiologists, people who you don't interact with, you'll still want to see your primary care physician and get that friendly bedside manner from a human. But the people who are behind the scenes in the hospital, radiologists scanning your X-rays and MRIs, Microsoft says that AI ChatGPT can do that way faster, way more effectively. It can find problems on the lab results much quicker, much faster. And so if you're trying to go into the field of radiology, you might want to learn to code.
Well, it's interesting to me because it seems like companies like Google and like Facebook, and this is one of the themes we touched on in that documentary we did, The Creepy Line. It's like if you give people a free product that seems to make their life easier, you give them email, you give them, hey, as a social media, I can see my friends, then they're not overly concerned about how it impacts their privacy or what information they're giving up in a way that it does negatively impact their life, because now you're now more easily manipulated in terms of like being sold things you didn't necessarily think you wanted because your phone heard you say a thing, right? And so I guess I could see why big tech companies would be big fans, but I don't know that why I asked you that question is I don't know that people necessarily agree with the premise that it's going to make their life harder, because so far people seem willing to take the tech that they think makes their life easier, and these guys laugh all the way to the bank.
Yeah, they will laugh all the way to the bank. And let's remember, it's like any technology. It's kind of like, the people that are on the lifeboat. Well, we're going to have to toss somebody over. If we toss somebody over, it's going to make things better for the rest of us, right? We'll live longer, we'll live better, there'll be more space. And
I'm just making a note that to never be on a lifeboat with you.
And actually,
what world is a lifeboat like somebody has to go? That's the opposite of the point of a lifeboat.
And that's a Controligarchs thought exercise. That came out of the Paul Ehrlich era, where it's like, everybody, or, a spaceship was another example where, you're on a lifeboat and you got a granny next to you, you got the pregnant woman next to you, like, who do you toss?
Right. And so the point is we've always had, technology that has improved, that it's made certain jobs obsolete. People that made bridles for horses when the automobile came around, their job took a nosedive, right? Not as many people riding horses. But the point is that invariably it's going to march forward. But as we know with every technology we've ever had, whether it's atomic splitting the atom or whether it's computers, it brings good and it brings bad. And the confidence with which the elites always seem to say, we know what we're doing, we can control this, no worries. If you look at the history of that, you got to have very little confidence that they actually can contain this in an effective way.
Well, that's why it's terrifying, I think. The idea of, here you got the Argentinian president saying, we need to be on the side of freedom,
yes,
which is the opposite of what Davos is standing for, essentially.
Yes.
And if Davos is saying, hey, we can work with the government to tell you what your future is going to look like, and it's going to look like this, I think to your point, technology's fine if we choose to adopt it and incorporate it into our lives, but if we're told to do so in the name of some larger existential threat, and that's where it gets nefarious, right? Because then it's like, okay, no. We're telling you that this problem exists, and we're going to make you use this solution, and this solution may actually cost you a lot more than you think it will.
Or we're going to steer you in that direction, right? We're going to nudge you. Those are terms they use. So, Seamus, give us the bottom line. What do you say to the person who says, this is a bunch of rich people that are meeting in Davos. I don't care. This doesn't really affect my life. They don't have power over me. Why should I care what happens in Davos? What would your answer be to them?
Yeah, I mean, ask your local farmer if what's happening in Davos affects their life, and you can see it all around the world. I mean, as Davos was going on this year, Berlin was at a gridlock standstill with tractors. I mean, tens of thousands, it looked like from the aerial shots of tractors shutting down Berlin. Now, just this week, Scotland farmers are rising up, and the Dutch farmers have already done so.
Because why?
Because of the regulations that are first talked about in Davos. I mean, it takes a few years for the plans of this year to be implemented. So as they talk about AI this year at Davos, it's going to take some time. And really, AI accomplishes so many of their plans. I mean, there's the universal basic income. This is something that they're talking about at the elite levels. Like, we've got to give checks to everybody, because if there are, let's just say they're right about the 60% of jobs affected and there are large amounts of job losses, those people are going to be begging for a universal basic income. And it's not really a coincidence, I don't think, that ChatGPT maker OpenAI is funding the largest universal basic income study in history.
Yeah.
OpenAI thinks it's going to be taking a lot of jobs. And so what does UBI accomplish for the World Economic Forum? A digital ID. Sam Altman has said, well, we need to have, a digital ID in order for you to, we need to know who you are so that you can get your checks. And so you may think to yourself, well, I would never comply with a digital ID, like, screw Bill Gates and his plans to give me a digital ID. Well, if you're out of a job and you're trying to feed your family and your only way of getting that is to sign up for the OpenAI digital ID, that's one thing. And then
a digital ID, just for people, like, so what's the concern with the digital ID?
A digital ID is where it centralizes all of your data, all of your information. You may think that, like, it's already captured by the government, but it's actually not everything you do is captured under a digital ID. And we saw it with the vaccine passports in Europe and in Israel, and we had the vaccine cards in America. You couldn't go into a restaurant, so
it gives them control.
It gives them
That's
control.
what a digital ID.
Yeah.
They can track you, and they can tell you can't do this and you can't do that.
Right, and then the central bank digital currency. I mean, this all falls under the Great Reset. What they're talking about this year. I mean, we're kind of in the Build Back Better phase of the Great Reset, where Klaus Schwab said we need to, in 2020, when he announced his Great Reset, we need to prepare for an angrier world. So, I mean, that's a prediction that sort of has come true, at least for the farmers. But he says this is going to give us an opportunity to digitalize everything. And so you've got the digital ID. And then Larry Fink of BlackRock has talked about central bank digital currencies. And a lot of these AI companies are, also working on digitizing currency. I mean, Sam Altman, OpenAI, has got his digital currency operations. And they are now saying that in order to get a UBI check, a central bank digital currency will be a very efficient way to get the checks out as fast as possible. And so that's how AI would accomplish some of their goals, ones that you may not sign up for, may not be on board with. But if you lose your job and you need money, you'll probably accept all of their plans.
It's about leverage and control.
Mm-hmm.
So even though that Davos, as you point out, is not a government, it's the headwaters. They're the headwaters of the river. They sort of help determine what's coming down the pike. So, Eric, are you worried about your job? You think you can be replaced by a robot?
I mean, I don't know that a robot can get you lunch as efficient as I can, but I guess one day we'll find out.
I said ketchup.
I will say, I think it is really interesting to the extent to which the Argentinian president saying, listen, state control leads to poverty, and Seamus saying poverty is essentially essential to adoption of the plans for the global elite.
Because of control.
Because, if you are poor enough, you will do all the things we want you to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, not in a conspiracy way, but it's just really smart to think through that thread And is that a common theme? Is this something that's going to make me poorer potentially, which then makes me more reliant on the things they want to make us have? Like, would you eat bugs, right? I mean, that was your thing. That to me, I still think about Controligarchs. Yeah, Bill Gates wants us to eat bugs. Well, would you eat bugs? Of course not. Well, what if you're hungry?
Yeah. What if you're hungry? And it goes to the heart of the old statement. I think Thomas Jefferson said it, and it applies universally. To the extent that someone can do something for you, they can do something to you.
Yeah.
So when you have control and power over somebody, they're poor or they need something, they want to go somewhere, and you have the ability to do something for them to give them universal income, that also gives them the ability to control you and to do something to you. And that is something that we here at GAI will always fight and will always resist, whether it's from the government or from a non-governmental organization like the World Economic Forum. Eric, your final thoughts. Are you going to Switzerland anytime soon?
No, it doesn't sound like I'll be able to afford to. So I'm going to go bury some cash in the yard.
and buy gold.
Yeah. No fertilizer, just burying cash.
Well, we appreciate it as always for you joining us. We also appreciate Seamus being here with us. I would encourage you to pick up his book, Controligarchs. It's an excellent read. It helped Kevin Roberts as he was flying to Davos, and it will certainly help you understand these issues in a vital way. If you want to know more about the Government Accountability Institute, you can find some of our research at thedrilldown.com, and you can find this podcast wherever fine podcasts are located. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time.